WCNC TV Charlotte. This is Flashpoint, where power and politics collide and the tough questions get asked and answered.
Good Sunday morning. Thanks for joining us here on Flashpoint. I'm Ben Thompson. Joining me today, community activist Colette Forrest, candidate for Charlotte City Council, Jacob Robinson, and candidate for State Treasurer Matt Leatherman. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you always.
All right, first up this week, the General Assembly met a court-imposed deadline of adopting new legislative district maps, with each chamber approving the other's map. Now, the General Assembly redrew nearly 80 out of 120 House districts and 50 for the Senate. The panel of 3 state judges who told the General Assembly they had to redraw the maps will now decide, with the help of a Stanford University law professor, whether legislators fix the problem that the courts found or not. The court may tweak the new maps if they want. The new maps will be only used for one election. That's the thing. The legislature will elected next year will draw yet another set of maps after the 2020 census. Lots of maps happening. The maps will be used for a decade unless lawsuits again force repeated redraws. All right, Matt, I'll begin with you. Your thoughts on these latest maps?
Sure. I do want to emphasize how important these maps are. Every 10 years, we have a census that allows for the reapportionment of districts, and the legislators who are in their seats at that time get to determine how those districts are drawn. In North Carolina, we do have an unfortunate tradition of elected officials choosing their voters in the way that they draw these maps instead of voters choosing their elected officials. So this is important. At the same time, we should not lose sight of the fact that for the past 9.5 years, we've been governed by maps that have been determined by the courts to be unconstitutional because they've discriminated on the basis of race or on party affiliation. So we want to get this right, but in the long term, we also want to respect the will of the voters, show that we care, and do this in an independent way.
Well, a lot of people saying that this is fairer than what was in the past. For folks who are wanting completely nonpartisan redistricting, this is still not it, far from it.
I mean, for all intents and purposes, the current districts were created using nonpartisan data. I'm a big proponent of actually making that formal in our state. You know, more than almost half of the states in the country have a nonpartisan way of creating districts, of redistricting.
Yeah.
We need to do that here in North Carolina as well.
Colette, how do you follow this? Some people say, I saw several people say, this is the fairer of the maps they've seen in a long time. Granted, this is not a new problem in North Carolina, but that what they've come up with, again, for only the next year, is fairer than we've seen.
So what's interesting to me is when I've looked at the maps, I feel like there was a bit of intentionality put into it. I look at Senator Jeff Jackson's district. Yeah. They've carved out eastern Charlotte, which is pretty liberal and progressive, and they've put more conservative constituents in the South Charlotte area in his district. I also noticed that with Representative Nassif Majid, they've carved out Mint Hill and put it in his district, which is quite a stretch, as well as Senator Joyce Waddell. So I feel there's been a little intentionality put to some of the elected officials' districts.
But it seems like not in this case, but the Supreme Court several months ago seemed to come out and say, hey, the mere idea of redistricting is in fact a partisan thing. I mean, that's what this is. Now, this 3-judge panel finding something different when it came to our local state legislative races. But inherently, if as long as it's done like this, there's going to be some politics involved.
As long as people's got the pen, it's going to be politics involved, because the people that have the pen are partisan. And they're the ones that are redrawing the maps.
And this is true. Now, it was the U.S. Supreme Court that did that. They put it back down to the states. And our state Supreme Court made a different and I think a better decision to try to get more independence into the process. But Colette, you're right. As long as it's an elected official drawing the maps, you're going to get a partisan outcome. Our job as elected officials, or at least aspiring ones, is to care about the will of the voters, not to try to choose our voters. And the way that you can show that you care is by listening to them, allowing independence in that process.
Glad you were going to chime in.
Absolutely could not agree more. We need to establish a process where we can do this independently. I totally agree with everything we're saying here.
Yeah.
My Democratic colleagues here on the panel.
I'm an unaffiliated voter.
My unaffiliated Democratic. But it is a nonpartisan issue.
Yeah. All right, switching gears now. This week, Dan Bishop sworn into Congress. Bishop won a special election of the 9th District last week, in case you missed it, defeating Democrat Dan McCready during his acceptance speech, though, last week. Bishop thanked President Donald Trump for his support and even had the president on speakerphone at one point there at his victory party. He says he's going to continue to stand behind the president. Take a listen.
I certainly will look for opportunities to defend the president and to urge that those who seem to be consumed with the idea of destroying the president, we have a lot of important common sense work to do, and we ought to get to that.
Bishop has been state senator since January of 2017. His seat will now have to be filled. Colette, I'll begin with you there. You're talking about, he was talking about areas of agreement. Do you feel like in this case he has a mandate going forward for this district as far as being strong Republican and supporting the president, or do you think he should be taking a more bipartisan sort of approach? So
clearly when he campaigned, he was mandate Trump all the way to victory. But I think now he needs to pivot and think about the needs of the voters in District 9, because we're talking from Cumberland to Charlotte. We're talking about hurricane efforts, people that have been affected by the hurricane. So to me, his job is not to defend Donald Trump. His job is to defend the best interests of those that reside in the 9th Congressional District, to look out for them. Do they need jobs? Do they need Medicaid for all? Do they need prenatal care? Right. Do they need resources? That is what his job is. So I'm prayerful that he will pivot and he will look at the needs of the voters and the inhabitants of the 9th Congressional District.
To piggyback on that, he won by slim margins. He did not have a very strong mandate from that district. And I think, he said that when in his acceptance speech, he said, hey, my door is open to my district first. Yeah. I want to serve them first. And so I think he took a tone that was more middle of the road and not necessarily far right like many expected based on his campaign. Yeah, and he's going to have to start running again here in a couple of months. That's the thing. Go ahead. So let's begin by doing the right thing. Congratulations to new Representative Bishop. He's now in Washington. He has this job. Congratulations to the district for having a representative. Please, let's start with the district. It's been 10 months since they've had somebody. Go ahead, I'm sorry. I agree, though, Colette. The job is now beginning, not ending, and it is to represent the 9th District and do so in a way that uplifts them. So I'm going to make a suggestion of something that he might consider. There's a nonprofit called Environment North Carolina that's been studying the drinking fountains in our schools, testing for lead in our drinking fountains at public schools. In Charlotte-Mecklenburg, of the 89 schools they tested, they found 41 that had lead in the drinking fountains. Here's a place that he can get started. That's what it means to represent the 9th District. Let's get down to that kind of business. I just want him to look at the needs of Eastern North Carolina first. I mean, they just suffered a hurricane, and I just want them to be taken care of. Round robin real quick with all three of you. You think he's odds-on favorite to win the next election in 2020? We've got to see who's running against him. You think McCready will run again? I think he's exhausted. Yeah, you couldn't fault him. You couldn't fault him if he said he's exhausted. I think it depends on how much he ties his wagon to Donald Trump. Yeah. Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? Based on this last election, I think it could be a potentially bad thing. Okay. I think that there's a whole lot riding on how districts are drawn. I suspect that he'll be back in. I'm not in a position to speak about Mr. McCready, but I think a whole lot rides on how these districts are drawn. All right. More Flashpoint after this.